El vikingo halla a un Apache congelado, y lo que hace conmociona al clan SAJÓN. The ice beneath Bjorn's boots cracked like breaking bones as he staggered through the merciless Norwegian wasteland, his breath forming desperate clouds in the bitter air of 867 AD, his heart hammered against his ribs, not from the cold, but from the crushing weight of dishonor that had driven him from his clan like a rabid wolf cast out from the pack. The wind howled through the fjords, carrying with it the scent of salt and impending death. Bjorn Ironwolf, once a name whispered with respect around Viking hearths, now meant nothing more than the footprints he left in the snow, soon to be erased by the next storm. His calloused fingers gripped the hilt of his ancestral blade, the only thing that still connected him to who he used to be before he'd made that fatal choice, before he'd refused to burn that Saxon monastery. The memory stabbed deeper than any enemy sword. The screams of the monks, the disappointed roar of his jarl, the way his own brothers had turned their backs as he was cast out into this frozen hell. Now the elements were slowly claiming him, and perhaps that was justice. Through the swirling snow, something caught his eye. A dark shape crumpled between the jagged rocks like a broken bird. Bjorn's warrior instincts flared. As he approached, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. The figure was a man, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Dark skin, strange clothes, and Bjorn's heart nearly stopped. Intricate runic tattoos covered the stranger's exposed arms, and some of those symbols. His sword practically leaped from its sheath as recognition hit him like a warhammer to the chest. Those runes, they were identical to the ones etched into his own blade by his grandfather's grandfather. Impossible! Absolutely impossible! Ei, antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer um alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. Ah, e me conta nos comentários, de qual cidade você está assistindo? Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. The stranger's chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate breaths. Death was claiming him slowly, like a wolf toying with wounded prey. Bjorn's mind raced. Saving this man would mean using his dwindling supplies, risking his own precarious survival. His clan had already branded him a betrayer of tradition. What would they think if they knew he'd helped a foreign stranger? But those runes, they called to something deep in his soul. With a growl of determination, Bjorn sheathed his sword and lifted the unconscious man. The stranger was lighter than expected, but in Bjorn's weakened state, every pound felt like carrying a full-grown boar. The nearest fishing village lay half a day's march through the treacherous terrain, assuming the weather held. As he stumbled forward, the stranger's head lolled against his shoulder. Despite everything, Bjorn felt something he thought had died in the frozen wastes. Purpose, maybe even redemption. Then the sound hit him like a physical blow. War horns, Saxon war horns, echoing through the valley with deadly precision. The deep, Haunting notes bounced off the ice-covered rocks, growing louder with each passing heartbeat. Bjorn's warrior instincts screamed danger as he spotted movement through the swirling snow. Armed figures emerging from the mist like vengeful spirits. His legs moved before his mind caught up, carrying both men toward a cluster of jagged rocks. He pressed his back against the frozen stone, the stranger's body heavy in his arms, barely daring to breathe as the Saxon patrol drew closer. Their metal clinked softly in the crisp air, their voices low and urgent. They were hunting something, or someone. The stranger in his arms began to murmur, words in a language that sounded like wind through ancient trees. Bjorn looked down, and his heart nearly stopped beating. The runic tattoos on the man's skin were glowing. Actually glowing, with a faint, ethereal light that pulsed in rhythm with his whispered words. As the Saxon boots crunched closer through the snow, Bjorn realized with growing terror that he might not have saved a dying traveler at all. He might have awakened something far older and more dangerous than any mortal enemy. Something that could either damn him forever or finally show him the path to redemption he'd been seeking in this frozen hell. The glowing runes pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The stranger's eyes snapped open like trapdoors to hell itself, revealing irises that burned with the same ethereal light as his tattoos. But it was his voice that turned Bjorn's blood to frozen mercury, a voice he'd heard whispering prayers over his dying mother 15 winters ago. "Hello, my son." The words hit Bjorn like a berserker's axe to the skull. Impossible. His father had died in that Saxon raid, his body never found, his funeral pyre built empty, except for his broken shield. Bjorn had sworn the blood oath over those cold ashes, had carved his first enemy's heart out in his father's name. No. The word tore from Bjorn's throat like a death rattle. "You're dead. I mourned you. You saved me." The man who had been Olaf Bloodaxe, terror of 3 kingdoms, pulled himself upright with unnatural strength. The glowing runes pulsed brighter, and now Bjorn could see the truth written in living light across his father's flesh. Symbols of binding, of servitude, of unspeakable pacts, just as the Saxon witch promised you would. The Saxon patrol's footsteps grew louder, but they weren't hunting anymore. They were approaching like men expecting a rendezvous. Through the swirling snow, Bjorn caught glimpses of their leader, a woman in ceremonial robes, her pale hands clutched around a twisted iron staff that seemed to drink in the light around it. 15 years I've served them, boy." Olaf's voice carried the weight of 1,000 betrayals. 15 years of feeding them Viking secrets, leading their armies to our sacred places, whispering the locations of our settlements into their eager ears. All because she showed me a vision, my precious son, cast out and dying in the wastes, too proud to accept help from anyone but his beloved father. Bjorn's ancestral sword trembled in his grip as the pieces fell into place like stones in an avalanche. His exile wasn't chance. His refusal to burn the monastery, the very mercy that had damned him, had been planted in his dreams, night after night, by foreign magic. Even his path through these specific mountains had been guided by subtle signs, phantom wolf tracks that led him exactly where they wanted him to go. Did you really think your sudden conscience was natural? Olaf laughed, and the sound was like ice cracking beneath a drowning man. You who could gut a Saxon priest without blinking? She's been in your head for months, nurturing that weakness, watering it like a poison garden. The Saxon witch stepped into view, her smile sharp enough to flay skin from bone. Behind her marched not just warriors, but a full contingent of something far worse, Viking thralls, his own kinsmen, walking with the dead-eyed shuffle of the magically enslaved. Bjorn recognized faces that should have been ash and memory. "Welcome home, Bjorn Ironwolf," the witch called out, her voice honey poured over broken glass. "Your father has told us so much about you, about your clan's hidden gold, about the secret passages into Kattegat, about your sister's wedding feast next week, when all the Jarls will gather in one great hall." The runes on Olaf's skin blazed like dying stars as he reached for Bjorn with hands that had once taught him to hold his first blade. "She only needs one more soul to complete the binding," he whispered. "One more Ironwolf heart, freely given out of love." Behind them, something howled in the darkness, not a wolf, but the sound of an entire kingdom's death cry, carried on the wind like a promise. Bjorn's ancestral blade moved before his mind could process the betrayal, not toward the Saxon witch or her enslaved thralls, but straight toward his father's glowing heart. The steel sang through the frigid air like a death song, but Olaf caught the blade bare-handed, his palm splitting open around the razor edge. Black blood dripped onto the snow, hissing like acid. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive, my son." Olaf's grip tightened on the blade, and where his blood touched the ancient steel, the metal began to crack like breaking ice. "This body, it died 15 years ago, just as you believed. What stands before you now is something far more useful to our Saxon friends." The witch stepped closer, her iron staff pulsing with malevolent energy. "The Apache shaman's soul makes for such a perfect vessel, doesn't it? His people's death magic meshes beautifully with Nordic flesh. We found his frozen corpse 3 moons past, wandering impossibly far from his desert homeland, apparently chasing visions of a great northern betrayer who would bring about the end times." Bjorn's world tilted like a ship in a maelstrom. Apache. The word hit him like a physical blow as he stared into eyes that held his father's memories, but burned with foreign fire. The tattoos weren't Nordic runes at all. They were Apache death symbols, binding a desert warrior's vengeful spirit into his father's desecrated corpse. The shaman's final prophecy was illuminating, the witch continued, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. He spoke of a Viking who would carry him willingly to his people's sacred burial ground, the very mountain where your grandfather first forged that precious blade of yours, where the old spirits still sleep beneath the ice, waiting for the right blood to wake them. The ground beneath Bjorn's feet began to tremble, not from cold, but from something stirring deep below the frozen earth. The Apache spirit, inhabiting his father's flesh, threw back its head and began to chant in a language that predated the Viking gods themselves. Each word fell like a hammer blow against reality. Your mercy sealed the pact. Olaf's mouth spoke with the Apache shaman's voice. By carrying me here willingly, you have fulfilled the first part of the prophecy. Now your sacred mountain will become the gateway for my people's war spirits, and they have been dreaming of revenge against the Pale Invaders for 300 winters. The ice around them began to crack in perfect circles, revealing glimpses of darkness below that seemed to pulse with its own terrible heartbeat. From those cracks rose the sound of drums, not Viking war drums, but the deep, primal rhythm of a desert people's death march. Bjorn's broken sword crumbled to dust in his trembling hands as he realized the magnitude of what he'd done. His act of compassion hadn't just doomed his clan, it had opened a doorway between worlds, allowing ancient American spirits to pour into Nordic soil like poison into a well. Behind the witch, the enslaved Viking thralls began to convulse as something else took hold of them. Their eyes rolled back, revealing only white, and when they opened again, they burned with desert fire. The funny thing about prophecies, the Apache spirit whispered through his father's ruined mouth, is that they always find a way to fulfill themselves. Even across oceans, even through time itself. The mountain began to scream. The mountain's scream shattered reality itself. But what emerged from the widening cracks wasn't the Apache war spirits Bjorn had feared. Instead, massive iron chains erupted from the depths. Chains that sang with familiar Nordic magic. Chains that bore the sacred hammer of Thor, etched into every link. The Apache spirit, inhabiting his father's corpse, stumbled backward, its arrogant smile cracking like ice under spring sun. Impossible, it hissed through Olaf's rotting lips. The bindings were severed. The northern gods abandoned this realm centuries ago. But the Saxon witch was laughing now, a sound like silver bells announcing a funeral. She raised her twisted staff high, and the iron chains responded, wrapping around the possessed corpse like hungry serpents. "Oh, you beautiful, prideful fool," she crooned to the trapped spirit. "Did you really think we needed you to open a gateway? Did you think any of this was about revenge?" Bjorn watched in growing horror as the truth unfolded like a blood-soaked banner. The witch's robes fell away, revealing not Saxon ceremonial dress, but the simple brown habit of a Christian monk. No, not just any monk, Brother Augustine, the very monk whose life Bjorn had spared in that monastery, the act of mercy that had damned him to exile. "You recognize me now, don't you, my dear Viking?" Augustine's voice carried the weight of divine authority that made Bjorn's bones ache. "I am Archbishop Augustine of Canterbury, and I have been hunting creatures like this Apache abomination for the glory of the one true God." The Saxon warriors, the enslaved thralls, all of it, theater to lure this ancient evil into the perfect trap. The Apache spirit writhed against the holy chains, its stolen flesh beginning to smoke and blister. "You used me," it snarled. "Used my hatred Just as I used his compassion, Augustine gestured toward Bjorn with something that might have been pity. Your refusal to burn our monastery wasn't weakness, Viking. It was divine intervention. God moved your heart to spare me, because he knew I would need to follow you here, to this sacred place where pagan magic runs strongest, where even a Christian's holy chains could bind a creature that has been poisoning the spiritual realm for 3 centuries. Bjorn's legs buckled as the full magnitude of his manipulation crashed over him. Not just the witch's deception, but something far more terrifying. His God-touched mercy had been orchestrated by the Christian deity itself. Every choice, every moment of compassion that had felt like his own moral awakening had been puppet strings pulled by a foreign god. The Apache's desert spirits were never meant to invade Nordic soil, Augustine continued, his voice growing in power as the chains tightened. They were meant to be trapped here, contained in this mountain that your ancestors foolishly believed belonged to Thor. This place has been holy to the Christ since before your people ever set foot on these shores. The possessed corpse of Bjorn's father let out one final, inhuman shriek before the flesh began to crumble away like ancient parchment. But as the Apache spirit was dragged down into the depths by chains of Christian iron, its burning eyes fixed on Bjorn with terrifying clarity. The prophecy isn't finished, Ironwolf son, it whispered with its dying breath. Your God may have won this day, but mine has already planted seeds in soil your Christ can never reach. Your sister's wedding feast, the golden cup she'll drink from, it carries more than wine. The mountain sealed itself with a sound like a tomb closing, leaving Bjorn alone with the archbishop in the sudden terrifying silence of a world where his ancestors' gods had apparently been lying to him his entire life. The silence stretched between them like a blade waiting to fall, broken only by the sound of Augustine brushing sacred dust from his monk's robes. But as Bjorn watched the archbishop's movements, something cold and terrible began to crawl up his spine. A recognition that went deeper than memory, deeper than blood. The way Augustine tilted his head when he smiled, the precise angle of his shoulders when he turned, the rhythm of his breathing. No, Bjorn whispered, the word torn from his throat like a prayer to gods who might no longer be listening. It cannot be. Augustine's laugh was soft, almost fond. You always were the clever one, my dear nephew. Even as a boy, you saw patterns others missed. The archbishop's face began to shift, the features rearranging themselves like wax in firelight. The brown tonsure dissolved, revealing flowing red hair. The stooped monk's posture straightened into the proud bearing of Viking nobility. Where Augustine had stood, now loomed Harold Bloodhawk, Bjorn's uncle, his father's own brother, the man who had supposedly died defending their village from Saxon raiders 20 winters ago. Uncle! The word came out broken, bleeding. Bjorn's knees hit the frozen ground as the full weight of the betrayal crashed over him. They said the Saxons took your head. We mourned you for 3 seasons. Oh, they tried, Harold said, running his fingers along a faint scar that circled his throat like a silver necklace. But their Christ God had use for me yet. You see, nephew, conversion isn't always about finding faith. Sometimes it's about finding purpose. His voice carried the casual cruelty of a man discussing the weather. And what greater purpose than delivering an entire kingdom into the hands of the one true God? The mountain around them began to hum with a sound that had nothing to do with trapped Apache spirits. Christian hymns, risen from the depths where those iron chains had disappeared. But the melody was wrong, ancient, predatory, hungry. "Every raid your clan ever planned," Harold continued, his smile growing sharper. "Every secret passage, every hidden treasure, every alliance and blood debt. I fed it all to Augustine's network before I took his place and his face. 20 years of intelligence gathering, nephew. 20 years of patient hunting." Bjorn's vision blurred as the implications hit him like an avalanche. The Saxon raids that had claimed his childhood friends, the mysterious defeats that had weakened their allies, the famines that came just when their enemies needed them most desperate. All of it orchestrated by the man who had taught him to throw his first axe, who had sung him to sleep with stories of Valhalla. "But the real masterpiece," Harold whispered, crouching down to meet Bjorn's shattered gaze, "was you, my beautiful, compassionate nephew, with your noble heart and your inconvenient mercy. Do you know how long I've been planting those dreams in your skull? How many years I've been nurturing that weakness, waiting for the perfect moment to use it?" The frozen ground beneath them began to crack again, but this time what emerged wasn't chains, it was roots. Massive, ancient tree roots that pulsed with their own pale light. And carved into each root, burned deep into the living wood, were crosses. Thousands upon thousands of crosses, stretching down into the earth's heart like the foundation of a cathedral, built from the world's bones. "The world tree was never Yggdrasil, boy," Harold said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "It was always the cross. Your pagan ancestors just misunderstood what they were seeing." From somewhere deep in the mountain came the sound of his sister's voice, not screaming, but singing. Wedding songs, Christian wedding songs, in a language Bjorn didn't recognize, but somehow understood in his soul. And underneath her melody, the voices of every jarl, every warrior, every child who would be at that feast, all of them singing, all of them converted, all of them waiting. "The golden cup she'll drink from tomorrow night," Harold whispered against Bjorn's ear, like a lover sharing secrets. "Contains wine blessed by the Pope himself. One sip, and her heart will belong to our Christ forever. One toast from her lips, and every guest will follow. The spiritual conquest of the North, completed in a single evening." Bjorn tried to speak, tried to scream, but found his voice had abandoned him entirely. In the distance, those wedding songs grew louder, more joyful, as if his sister could already taste her salvation on the wind. But as Harold's whispered promises of Christian conquest filled the air like poisonous honey, something impossible happened. Bjorn began to laugh, not the broken sob of a defeated man, but the deep, rolling laughter of someone who had just witnessed the greatest joke the gods had ever played. The sound echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, growing stronger with each breath until even the distant wedding songs seemed to falter. 20 years, Bjorn gasped between fits of mirth that bordered on madness. 20 years you've been planning this masterpiece, uncle. 20 years of patient scheming. He wiped tears from his eyes, tears that froze solid before they could fall. And you never once thought to ask why I really spared that monastery. Harold's triumphant smile began to crack like ice under spring sun. What are you talking about, boy? Bjorn's laughter died as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the terrible silence of a predator about to strike. When he looked up at his uncle, his eyes held the same burning intensity that had made enemies flee across 3 kingdoms. I didn't spare Augustine out of mercy, you fool. I spared him because the old woman told me to. What old woman? But even as Harold asked, his face was already draining of color. The crone who visited me in dreams for months before that raid? Bjorn said, rising to his feet with movements that suddenly seemed too fluid, too graceful for mortal flesh. The one with the missing eye and the ravens on her shoulders. The one who showed me exactly which monk to spare. Exactly how to refuse my Joral's orders. Exactly how to get myself exiled to these specific mountains. The Christian roots emerging from the earth began to wither and blacken as something far older stirred beneath them. The crosses carved into the wood started bleeding, not the red blood of martyrs, but the golden ichor of forgotten gods awakening from their long slumber. You think your Christ planted mercy in my heart? Bjorn's voice carried harmonics that made the very air tremble. You think 20 years of manipulation was your idea, uncle? You've been dancing to her tune since the moment you first converted. Every move you made, every betrayal you orchestrated, all of it designed to bring us to this moment, to this place where the old contracts still hold power. Harold stumbled backward as the truth hit him like a berserker's axe. The Apache spirit, the supposed trap for ancient evil, his nephew's carefully cultivated compassion, none of it had been about Christian conquest. It had all been bait in a trap so vast, so patient, that even gods had been fooled by its scope. The world tree was never meant to become the cross, Bjorn whispered, and now his voice carried the weight of prophecy itself. The cross was meant to become the world tree. Every conversion, every soul you thought you were winning for your Christ, you were actually feeding them to something much, much older. From the depths of the mountain came a sound like the world's first heartbeat, and the withered Christian roots burst into flames that burned with all 9 colors of the rainbow. In that fire, shapes began to form. Massive, terrible, beautiful shapes that had been waiting patiently beneath the earth for their faithful servant to complete his work. The old woman sends her regards, Bjorn said, as his uncle's stolen Christian flesh began to smoke and crack. She says to tell you that Ragnarok was never about ending the world. It was about reclaiming it. The mountain split open like an egg, and something infinitely ancient began to climb toward the light. But as the ancient thing began its ascent from the mountain's shattered heart, its form writhing with the terrible beauty of forgotten divinity, something impossible happened. It stopped. Mid-emergence, the godlike entity froze as if struck by invisible chains, far stronger than any Christian iron. From the smoking ruins of Harald's flesh came a sound that chilled Bjorn's blood more than any winter wind. Laughter. Not his uncle's voice, not Augustine's stolen tones, but something else entirely. Something that spoke with the authority of carved stone and eternal flame. "Did you really think," the voice said as Harald's broken body began to reconstruct itself with movements that defied nature, "that the All-Father would trust his most important work to a mere Viking? Even one as beautifully manipulated as you?" Bjorn's triumphant grin crumbled like ancient parchment as the truth hit him with the force of Mjolnir itself. The flesh knitting itself back together wasn't Harald's, wasn't Augustine's. The face emerging from the divine fire was one he knew better than his own reflection. Weathered by countless battles, marked by wisdom older than kingdoms, crowned with an iron circlet that had never tarnished, despite centuries of wear. "Grandfather," he whispered, the word torn from his throat like a confession before execution. Eric the rune speaker stood before him, in flesh that should have been ash for 40 winters, his single remaining eye blazing with power that made the mountain itself seem small. The empty socket, where his other eye had been sacrificed to the world tree, wept liquid starlight that hissed against the frozen ground. "Every move you made, boy," Eric said, with the terrible fondness of a master watching his greatest student finally understand the lesson. "Every choice, every moment of mercy or rage, all of it carved in stone before your first breath. The old woman in your dreams, the ravens on her shoulders." His laugh was like the sound of glaciers breaking. "Did you never wonder why she had my voice?" The ancient entity, trying to emerge from the mountain's depths, let out a sound of pure frustration, its divine essence straining against bonds that suddenly made Christian holy chains look like spider silk. Bjorn could see the truth now, written in runes of fire across the creature's struggling form. Not the return of the old gods, but their eternal prisoner, something far older and hungrier that had been feeding on their power for millennia. The Apache spirit, the Saxon conspiracy, your uncle's 20-year deception, all of it, theater, grandson. All of it designed to bring you to this place with your guard down, your heart open, your will focused entirely on awakening what you thought were your ancestors' gods. Eric stepped closer, and Bjorn could smell the scent of funeral pyres that never burned, of sacrifices that never ended. But the entity you've helped me trap today, it's the thing that devoured them all, the hunger that comes before creation, the void that swallows even Ragnarok itself. Behind them, the sounds of his sister's wedding feast grew impossibly louder. But now, Bjorn could hear the truth beneath the celebration. Not human voices at all, but something wearing human masks. Something that had been wearing them for so long that even the wearers had forgotten what lay beneath. "The feast begins at sunset," Eric whispered, pulling a blade from the air itself, not iron or steel, but crystallized starlight that sang with the voices of every soul it had ever claimed. "And you, my dear grandson, are going to help me serve the main course to our very hungry guest. The mountain sealed itself with a sound like the universe holding its breath, trapping the ancient entity below, while something infinitely worse prepared to feast above. In the distance, wedding bells began to toll, but they rang with the rhythm of a funeral march that had been playing since the world's first dawn. The crystallized starlight blade trembled terribly. Impossibly wrong. The old man's face was cracking like ice under spring sun, revealing glimpses of something beneath, not flesh, but carved wood. Ancient, weathered wood, marked with symbols that predated even the oldest runes. Grandfather? Bjorn's voice came out as barely a whisper, but Eric's form was already collapsing, the illusion crumbling like autumn leaves. What stood before him now wasn't his ancestor at all, but a towering figure carved from the heartwood of Yggdrasil itself, the world tree made manifest, walking in the shape of mortal flesh. The wooden giant's voice was the sound of forests burning, of roots tearing through stone. Your grandfather has been dead for 60 winters, child of iron. I merely borrowed his memories when I needed to ensure certain bloodlines survived long enough to serve their purpose. Bjorn's legs buckled as the magnitude of the deception crashed over him. Not just this moment, but his entire bloodline's history. Every story his grandfather had supposedly told him around winter fires. Every lesson about honor and sacrifice. Every tale of Valhalla and the gods' glory. All of it lies whispered by an entity that had been wearing his ancestor's face like a funeral mask. The Ironwolf clan was never chosen by Odin. The world tree continued, its wooden features shifting with each word. You were cultivated by me, bred through careful generations to produce exactly what I needed, a bloodline capable of containing something even I cannot destroy. The trapped entity deep within the mountain began to laugh, a sound like reality tearing at its seams. Finally, it called up through layers of stone and root. The tree admits what it truly is, not Yggdrasil the life-giver, but Yggdrasil the prison keeper. Tell him the rest, old branch. Tell him about the wedding feast. The wooden giant's expression twisted into something that might have been regret, if trees could feel such human emotions. From the distance came the sound of celebration, growing louder. And now Bjorn could hear individual voices among the revelers. His sister Astrid's laughter, his clan brothers calling toasts, the skalds singing songs of glory and eternal bonds. All of them gathered in one great hall, all of them drinking from the sacred cups. The wedding feast was never about conversion, the world tree whispered, its voice heavy with the weight of eons. It was about consolidation. Every soul that drinks tonight becomes part of me, their life force feeding my eternal vigil. Your sister, your kinsman, every Jarlan warrior, all woven into my roots to strengthen the prison that holds back the hunger before creation. Bjorn's scream of rage echoed off the mountain walls as he realized the true scope of the trap, not just his manipulation, but his entire people's doom. Generation after generation, raised like livestock, their strongest gathered at moments of celebration to be harvested like wheat before winter. But as his cry of anguish reached its peak, something impossible happened. The sound that came back wasn't an echo, it was an answer. A war cry that shook the very foundations of the mountain, carrying with it the voices of every Ironwolf who had ever lived, every warrior who had ever fallen, every ancestor whose memory had been stolen and twisted by the tree's deception. The world tree's wooden face contorted in shock as spectral figures began materializing around them. Not the peaceful dead of Valhalla, but wrathful spirits burning with betrayal's fire. At their head stood the real Eric the Rune Speaker, his ghostly form blazing with fury that made his single eye look like a dying star. You think the dead don't remember, old branch? The true Eric snarled, his spectral blade already moving toward the tree's heartwood. You think we didn't know what you were? The wedding feast begins. Yes, but not the feast you planned. In the distance, the celebration sounds shifted, becoming something else entirely. Not joy, but battle cries. Not wedding songs, but funeral dirges for a cosmic parasite that had finally overplayed its ancient hand. The spectral army of the true dead surged forward with the fury of 1,000 broken oaths, their ghostly weapons raised against the world tree's deception. But as Eric's phantom blade touched the ancient wood, something catastrophic happened that froze every soul, living and dead, in absolute terror. The tree began to bleed. Not sap, not ichor, but human blood, gallons of it, streaming from every cut branch and carved rune. And in that crimson torrent, faces appeared. Thousands upon thousands of faces, all screaming in silent agony. The faces of every Viking who had ever died, every soul the tree had claimed to be protecting through its eternal vigil. Do you see now? The imprisoned entity's voice rose from the mountain's depths with terrible satisfaction. Do you understand what your precious world tree truly is? Look at the faces in the blood, little wolves. Look and recognize your own kin. Bjorn's heart stopped as he saw them. His mother's face twisted in eternal torment. His childhood friends, his fallen battle brothers. All of them trapped within the tree's heartwood. Their souls ground up like grain to feed its endless hunger for power. The world tree hadn't been guarding anything. It had been farming them. But the true horror came when his father's face materialized in the flowing blood. Not the possessed corpse he'd encountered earlier, but Olaf Bloodaxe's actual spirit, his eyes wide with recognition and desperate hope. "Son," his father's ghost whispered from within the crimson stream. "The blade, your ancestral blade. It was never meant to serve the tree." His spectral form reached out with trembling fingers toward the shattered remnants of Bjork's sword. The runes, they're not binding spells, they're a key. The world tree's wooden features contorted in panic as it realized what was happening. The broken blade fragments on the ground began to glow with their own inner fire, reassembling themselves piece by piece. But this time, the steel sang with a different music, not the song of Nordic gods, but something far older and infinitely more terrifying. No, the tree's voice cracked like splitting timber. The weapon was destroyed. The bloodline was broken. The key was lost. "You never understood," Eric's ghost said, his spectral form growing brighter as the blade reformed in Bjorn's shocked hands. We didn't forge that sword to serve gods or trees or ancient hungers. We forged it to kill them all. The reassembled blade pulsed with power that made the mountain itself tremble. Carved along its fuller, in script that predated human civilization, were words that translated themselves directly into Bjorn's mind. World Eater's Bane. Not a weapon crafted by his ancestors, but something far more terrible. A relic from the time before time, when the first beings had to choose between existence and the void that wanted to devour it. The entity trapped below, his father's spirit called out from the tree's bleeding bark. It's not the hunger before creation. It's creation's first defender. The thing I helped trap here. The only force that can devour the devourers themselves. The wedding songs in the distance suddenly cut off, replaced by screams that carried on the mountain wind. But these weren't cries of fear. They were shouts of liberation. At the feast, every soul who had drunk from the sacred cups was breaking free from the tree's influence, their borrowed strength returning to their bodies as the ancient prison began to crack. Bjorn raised the reassembled blade toward the bleeding world tree. But as he did, one final revelation hit him like a physical blow. The entity below hadn't been trying to escape its prison. It had been trying to warn him, and the tree's panic meant only one thing. Somewhere in the distance, something infinitely worse than either guardian or prisoner had caught the scent of their cosmic battle. Something that had been waiting patiently for them to weaken each other enough for it to finally feed. From beyond the mountain's peaks came a sound like the universe screaming, and the stars themselves began to go out one by one. As the stars died one by one above them, Bjorn raised the World Eater's Bane toward the cosmic darkness that hungered beyond the peaks. But instead of striking the bleeding world tree, he did something that shocked every soul present. He turned the blade on himself, driving it deep into his own heart. The ancient weapon drank his blood with terrible hunger, but as it did, something magnificent happened. Every drop of Ironwolf blood that touched the steel began to sing, not with pain, but with the voices of every ancestor who had ever lived, every warrior who had ever fallen, every soul. The key was never meant to unlock chains, Bjorn gasped as his life poured into the blade, his voice growing stronger even as his body weakened. It was meant to become one with the lock itself. The world tree's wooden form began to convulse as something impossible occurred. Instead of feeding on Bjorn's sacrifice, both tree and the imprisoned entity below found themselves being pulled into the blade. Not destroyed, but transformed. Their eternal conflict, their endless hunger, their cosmic manipulation, all of it flowing into steel that had been forged in the first days of creation, specifically for this moment. A prison that moves, Eric's ghost whispered, with something approaching wonder. A guardian that chooses, a hunger that serves rather than devours. The blade in Bjorn's chest began to change, its steel flowing like liquid starlight until it reformed into something new. Not a weapon, but a pendant that pulsed with contained galaxies. In that moment of transformation, Every soul the tree had devoured was released, streaming upward like silver fire toward whatever afterlife they had truly earned. From the distant feast came new sounds, not screams, but laughter. True laughter, as his sister and kinsmen found themselves free for the first time in generations, their souls no longer fodder for cosmic entities, but their own to command. Bjorn collapsed to his knees as the pendant settled against his chest. But his sacrifice had achieved something no god or monster had ever managed. The thing beyond the peaks, the true devourer that had been waiting for them to weaken each other, found nothing to feed on. The cosmic buffet it had expected was gone, consolidated into a single mobile prison that could never be trapped or tricked or manipulated again. Years later, when the skalds sang of the Viking who saved not just his clan, but existence itself, they would tell of how Bjorn Ironwolf became the eternal warden, not chained to one mountain, but free to walk between worlds, ensuring that cosmic parasites could never again feast on mortal souls. The stars rekindled themselves one by one, and in their light, his sister's grandchildren would grow up in a world where gods served mortals, not the other way around, where mercy was strength, not weakness, where a single moment of compassion could echo through eternity like the greatest song ever sung. The saga was complete, but the legend would never die. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do skald. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.